Will South Africa choose the same disastrous policies adopted by Zimbabwe and Venezuela, nationalizing private lands in the name of social justice? They call it radical economic transformation. South African President Jacob Zuma, pushed by Marxist-Leninist radical Julius Malema, is demanding changes to the constitution that would allow the government to seize privately held land. They say they want to redistribute it along racial lines, seizing property from the white minority, giving it to the black majority. Supporters say they are merely righting the wrongs of history, but we've seen this situation play out before.
Tensions over land ownership are at boiling point in South Africa. The peaceful redistribution of land that was promised by Nelson Mandela after the apartheid era 20 years ago has largely failed, and that's left millions of black South Africans angry and impatient.
The proposed land grab is eerily similar to what happened in Zimbabwe, where the government used the people's justifiable anger at white colonialism as an excuse to seize property and consolidate a totalitarian state.
The fastest way to impoverish the country economically would be to adopt that kind of policy whereby you would have properties being confiscated, being expropriated without compensation whatsoever on a coercive basis. That would be the fastest way for the economy to implode. Besides that happening internally, it would send a negative signal to potential investors out there that this is not the market to which they should aspire to direct their investments. So they would look at other markets for them to invest in.
This is a far cry from the rainbow nation that Nelson Mandela once dreamed of when he was fighting for racial equality. And even now, the Minister of Tourism in Zimbabwe is warning South Africa not to make the same mistakes his country made. Of course, without stable property rights, it's impossible for any country to thrive. And if the South African government follows through on its threats, expect a similar result to Zimbabwe: widespread poverty, starvation, even death. In the real world, government land reform efforts like these are just a power grab, not justice, racial or otherwise. How does this happen? How does a relatively prosperous nation like South Africa fall down the rabbit hole of tyrannical government? In truth, the seeds were sown a long time ago. It all starts with the policy of apartheid, literally meaning separation, the state-imposed racism that continues to cast a shadow over South Africa's entire history. Ayn Rand once wrote that racism is the lowest, most crudely primitive form of collectivism. It says that a man is to be judged not by his own character and actions, but by the characters and actions of a collective of ancestors. She also called it a barnyard form of collectivism, by and for brutes, that treats people like animals, not individuals. Racism isn't a form of government, but it's one of the deadly isms all the same. Throughout history, race has often been a tool of totalitarians, a way of dividing people, and a convenient scapegoat for political opportunists. But there is perhaps no better example of how government uses racism to oppress and divide people than the years of apartheid in South Africa. South Africa had a long history of racial tension before apartheid. When the Dutch colonized the country, they implemented segregation, separating the white colonists from the black natives. But it wasn't until 1948, when the Nationalist Party won the general election and ascended to power, that total government institutionalization of racism began.
What was called apartheid was what happened after the previous government, the National Party, came to power in 1948. But going right back to the beginning, there has been discrimination in South Africa, racial, after the white colonists landed in 1652, and as between tribes, oppression of one tribe by another, one group by another, so that South Africa has a long history of oppression and discrimination of one group by another. And I think it's correct to say that what we think of as apartheid really started right in the beginning in 1652, but the name was given to it and it was formally created into quite a sophisticated policy and eventually quite a brutal policy from 1948.
With the Population Registration Act of 1950, the government arbitrarily divided everyone into 4 classifications: black, white, colored, or Indian. Each group was given its own special legal privileges or restrictions, creating a social hierarchy not unlike feudal aristocracy. Apartheid started out in the public sector only, but it quickly spread to cover almost every aspect of life, governing where you could live, who you could marry, and even what kind of job you could have.
There were about 100 laws that constituted apartheid. It wasn't one law. And they ranged from things like only black people could get a trading license in a black residential area, subject to a radius law that is no more than, in those days, 4 miles from another, whereas that law did not apply in a white area. Then there were different laws governing divorce and marriage, matrimony for black and white people. By the way, that still is the case to this day under common law, depending on how one works. But it was a wide range of laws that protected certain jobs for white people, called job reservation, that allowed white people to form trade unions, but not black people, that prohibited mixed marriage, which my sister was in a mixed marriage. People of different races couldn't marry. You couldn't play sport together, so white and black people couldn't play football or soccer or basketball or whatever. You couldn't go to the same cinema, you couldn't go to the same restaurant, everything had separate facilities. You could only run a business if you were in the group area for your race. So it was a range of about 100 statutes or laws or acts that together comprised what was called apartheid.
Labor laws like minimum wages and licensing requirements were explicitly designed to keep the non-white population out of the labor force, preserving the best jobs for the ruling white minority. These regulations exist in America as well. And while most people don't think of them as racist, in practice the effect is the same. Those with the fewest skills and the least education get boxed out, to the benefit of the governing elites.